tomorrow's GCSE Geography, paper 3, and a lot of people do not like this paper because it involves fieldwork, a lot of analysis, and some really quite tricky question styles, but that's fine because in this video I'm going to be going through exactly how you can be applying your knowledge to make sure that you are maximising your marks in every single one of these questions, making that grade 9 something you are definitely going to be achieving. First of all, you need to be really familiar with the command words. This is something you can look at in 20 minutes and get into your head. It is really quite simple and I highly recommend that you do it this evening if you have not done already. You need to make sure that you know that when different types of words come up, that means you have to structure your response in a different way. For example, if your command word is explain, then you're talking about the causes and you're talking about the effects, and that is it. It is a very sort of structured response that is, this happens, and then that happens, and then this next thing happens. Very simple. However, if you get a command word that is evaluate, while it might feel very similar to an explain question, you need to be stating pros, you need to be stating cons, and crucially, you need to be giving a conclusion. If you don't give a conclusion, you cannot get top word marks. That is why understanding the different command words is uber important. Other command words that you can get include assess. Now, assess is basically the same as evaluate, pros, cons, conclusion. You can get to what extent, which is still pros, cons, conclusion, but your conclusion needs to be littered with caveats. So that means you need to be saying, okay, are there certain contexts in which your conclusion does not hold? Does your conclusion hold more strongly if a certain thing about a country is true? Those sorts of things need to be littered into these to what extent questions. So it's not so much a yes, no, it's a yes, but, or no, however. Fieldwork questions. These questions are tricky, and you might get a mix of fieldwork that you are familiar with, the exact fieldwork that you did, and some questions that perhaps you are not familiar with using different styles of fieldwork, and you need to be able to respond to all of these. Now, critical things to remember are that when you are describing how fieldwork should be taking place, you need to be very specific about this happens, then this happens, building up a chain of reasoning. Crucially, you're using equipment, you've got to state exactly what that equipment is, and you've got to explain why it is being used as well. Basically, after every step, you should be giving a bit of an explanation as to why that happens. For example, are you taking a certain action in precaution to prevent some other variable influencing the results? Are you doing some step because you want to improve the accuracy or the validity of your results? You want to be using those sorts of buzzwords. You want to be thinking about how, for example, fieldwork could be improved. Would you be repeating it multiple times? How could you identify anomalies? What would you do to get rid of them? And always, always, always discuss reliability and limitations as much as you can. So, for example, if you're talking about fieldwork that involves working with a river or something, you might be talking about the limitations of, well, if you're using an impeller and it's very still water, it might not work, that sort of thing. That's a very basic example, but you do want to be bringing some limitations in there. And also, when you're given data and asked about that data, never just copy it. You always want to be thinking about patterns and trends. You want to be looking at it and thinking, okay, what is the relationship between the variables? In what way does that relationship change, or is that relationship constant? Now, what I mean by that is if you have a graph, very simply, variable x, variable y, and it looks like a straight line, okay, it's got a constant relationship between those variables. But if we've got more of a curve, something like this, then, okay, there is a relationship between those variables, but that relationship changes over time because the gradient of that curve is changing over time. Do you see what I mean? You're trying to bring in some more analysis. And critically, with fieldwork, what comes up a lot in examiners' reports is you need to be answering exactly what is asked. That sounds easy, but it is easier said than done, because a lot of the time people will read the question quite quickly and assume what it is going to ask. Don't do that. Make sure you read it very carefully, because they like to use similar but not the same questions as from past papers. And if you've gone through a lot of the past papers and are familiar with the past paper questions, your brain might automatically jump to, oh, this is really exactly like that, past paper question from 2018. I'm going to write that same thing down here. When in reality, they've tweaked it ever so slightly to make the focus different. And they do this on purpose to stop people basically memorizing previous answers. So you need to be hyper aware of that possibility and reading and making sure you are identifying the focus of that question that you are answering every single time before you begin answering it. You also want to make sure that you have a really good understanding of OS maps for this paper, making sure you understand how contour lines work, what the different symbols are, what they mean, what they relate to. This is a paper where those skills are absolutely critical, and honestly, it will take you 10 minutes this evening to find an OS map and just get the tutorial. There are video tutorials. If you go into YouTube and go like OS maps tutorial, it'll explain every single feature of an OS map in about 5 minutes flat. You've got 5 minutes to spare, look over it. Even if you're quite confident, this can be something that is just really very useful to make sure that information is fresh in your brain. I also want to take some time to discuss very briefly graphs and maths. Maths, write every single step down, even if it is the most obvious thing ever. Write down exactly what you're doing, even if you're just calculating the mean. Write down what you're typing into your calculator, particularly if you have a lot of data entries that you're adding up. Writing everything down can just smooth out the fact that you might end up making a mistake when you're typing things into your calculator that results in the end answer being wrong. At least the examiner knows that you used the correct method, and it will have just been, you typing something wrong, so you won't lose as many marks. And with graphs themselves, make sure you label both of the axes, you give your graph a title, you draw it big enough, and you pay particularly close attention to ensuring that the scale is sort of appropriate and it works effectively for the data that's been given. Something else that is really important with geography is they have marks set aside for spelling, punctuation, grammar, but also tied in with that is the use of specialist geographical terms. So you need to be making sure that you are, quote unquote, thinking like a geographer. That's what my teacher would always tell me, and it definitely helps you in these questions, because there is a tendency, particularly because in the majority of exam boards this paper is focused upon the UK context, there's a tendency for certain areas to be discussed in a way that is, quote unquote, like the common sense way. Do you know, when you ask the question where the vast majority of your peers would have an opinion, but you need to distinguish between that and what you're doing, which is a piece of geographical writing, and therefore you need to be using these key terms, you need to be familiar with them. Again, if you're feeling slightly shaky on this, the best thing that I would recommend you do is go on any website that provides, geography help. Like even Physics and Maths Tutor has a lot of geography resources, and just getting glossaries of words, going to the back of your textbook and just reading the glossary, the keywords and their definitions, that is what is going to level up your writing and mean that you do hit those sort of use of geographical keywords marks. Before I finish this, I also do want to mention very briefly, for those longer response questions, take some time to plan out. I know geography can be a very time-pressured exam, but taking just 2 minutes to form a coherent plan in your head is going to be so useful. For a lot of the essays that I was writing during my exams, they were time-pressured exams, but I would sometimes take up to 15 minutes to plan my essays, because I knew that having a coherent understanding of what I was going to be writing would allow my introduction to be more powerful, and would also keep me on track and stop me waffling. Now, obviously, don't spend 15 minutes planning your essays, you should be spending about 15 minutes writing them, but 1 to 2 minutes that just making sure you have, this is what I'm going to say in this paragraph, this is what I'm going to say in that paragraph, this is what I'm going to say here, okay, that's my conclusion, so what should I be saying in my introduction? I should be outlining the, way, all of the top points that I'm going to be covering in this essay. Excellent, let me get started. So those are my tips for GCSE Geography Paper 3. Good luck, I hope it goes amazingly well. As ever, if you have any questions, do let me know in the comments and I will do my best to respond.